everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of MOJO Rising, How to Make Cancer Suck Less. This is your host, Julie Stevens, and we have a really exciting episode for you today because we are going to talk with another survivor around the choices they made and what they're doing to maintain a cancer-free status in their body. So I couldn't be more excited to share with you our guest today. But this is a really special guest, because he is a family friend and someone I've known for many, many years, but also because he is a medical doctor. And so he's going to give a little bit of perspective around his journey and what he chose to do, both to bring together conventional and traditional healing approaches. So I'm really excited for you guys to spend some time. And I can't wait to introduce you to Dr. Pappas. So Dr. Pappas, would you like to share a little bit about your background?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So I am board certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation. Normally, I treat patients with musculoskeletal issues, patients who might need orthopedic surgery, and usually try to help them avoid orthopedic surgery if possible. And so I am a physician, but obviously I don't treat cancer. I'm not an oncologist. So, I'm here to kind of talk about my own story and some medical decisions that I made, but I wouldn't say that like I'm recommending medical advice for those patients with cancer, but I do think that I've experienced some things that could likely help others.
And I thank you so much for clarifying that. And actually, how should I refer to you during this call? Do you want me to refer to you as Nadios or Dr. Pappas?
Why don't we'll go with Nadios is fine.
Okay.
For this, yeah, the way um, people can think of me as a medical doctor, or they can think of me as somebody with cancer, but I'm not here to tell people what to take or what to do in their own lives, but I do think that I have some insights that could help them.
Wonderful. And we're so appreciative of your time here. So thank you so much for spending some time. So tell me a little bit. You, like me, don't look like the average cancer patient. You look strong and vibrant and healthy and young. So tell me a little bit about your diagnosis story.
So I was diagnosed with testicular cancer in early October of 2022. And actually, testicular cancer tends to affect younger, healthy males. But I was very much out of the standard deviation of age ranges for people with testicular cancer. So typically, most testicular cancer patients, they get it somewhere between ages 18 and 29, in that range, and I was 37 when I was diagnosed. So not the typical range. And I don't know. I had kind of a weird 3 months before being diagnosed with testicular cancer, and I'm not sure if that really contributed to it or not. About 3 months before I was diagnosed, I was in a bad car accident. And after that, I wasn't sleeping well for weeks. And I was had high blood pressure from the accident. Transiently, it went away, luckily, eventually. But I was in a really bad what you'd call a high sympathetic state, meaning your sympathetic nervous system is where adrenaline is released and you get that fight or flight response. And I was just chronically stressed for weeks as a result of that accident, not sleeping as a result of that. And then about 6 weeks after that, I ended up getting COVID for the first time, and it just wiped me out, absolutely wiped me out. I was out of it for a week. And within 2 weeks of getting COVID, I actually started to have a lot of swelling in my left testicle. And I didn't think it was cancer at first, actually. I looked it up and I was like, okay, well, this could be like post-viral orchitis, swelling of the testicle. And I even found a study that was like, oh, 10 or 20% of males with COVID end up getting orchitis. And I thought, okay, well, this is just orchitis. This will go away. And so, probably for the next 4 to 6 weeks or so, I just thought this is going to get better and it's going to go away. And it didn't. And then, actually, what ended up happening was a hurricane came through. And as the hurricane came through, my testicles started getting more and more painful to the point where it was unbearable and I couldn't sleep. And so I ended up going to the hospital while this hurricane was coming through, and they did an ultrasound and found that I actually was diagnosed immediately with testicular cancer. They did some tumor markers, and the very next day, I got a radical orchiectomy, meaning that they removed the left testicle and everything associated with it. Fortunately for me, the CT of the abdomen showed that it had not spread at that point anywhere. But then basically the pathology report came back and confirmed that I had a very large, what's called a seminoma, stage 1B. And then at that point, I had to basically figure out whether or not I wanted to do preventative round of chemotherapy. So um, in the case of testicular cancer, chemotherapy is actually very effective against chemotherapy, but it's a pretty harsh chemo regimen. And they have the option, based on a study, to do a lighter chemo regimen in somebody in my case where, okay, we remove it surgically, there's no spread at that time that we can see on the CT scan. Maybe if we do a lighter chemo regimen, does that reduce the chance of the cancer coming back? And there is a study that shows that the chance of the cancer coming back goes from somewhere between 15 and 20% to about 2 or 3% with the light chemotherapy. And so I remember racking my brain for a week and asking other people what they thought. And because if you get chemotherapy and the cancer was not coming back, then you've introduced chemotherapy into yourself when you didn't necessarily need it. And, as everybody knows, there are some pretty harsh complications long term from chemotherapy, or at least there can be, right? And so in my mind, there was, an 80% chance that if I did the chemotherapy, I would do it unnecessarily. On the other hand, if I didn't do the chemotherapy and the cancer came back, now I'm in for the very harsh chemotherapy. And so I ended up reaching out to a friend of a friend who was an oncologist, and he definitely advised me to do the chemotherapy. And then I established with my oncologist, and he advised me not to. And so I ended up not doing the chemotherapy after my tumor was removed. Um, but
Let's talk a little bit about
as
that. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you because I want to come back and spend some time here. But like
Yeah, go for it.
a couple things. One, it sounds like stress was a major component in your story as well. And it certainly was for me. And it sounds like multiple different stressors and multiple different levels played into your body really struggling with cancer. And so, A, I'm so sorry to hear your story. And B, I can only imagine your family in the middle of a hurricane with you having these issues, how scary that was for everyone. So I can picture how difficult those moments must have been, and how hearing those words, you have cancer, and then having to act right away puts a lot of stress in someone as well. So lots to unpack there.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, I remember being, I was pretty much chronically stressed from the last 6 months of 2022. I would say I was very stressed. I didn't mention my wife was 9 months pregnant at the time when I was diagnosed with cancer. So that was stressful. And then we had also, uh, about 10 days after I was in that car accident, we moved houses as well, and we were trying to sell our other house. So there was a lot of um, stress going on. And of course, I was still trying to function as a doctor working full time.
Okay,
So,
let's just take a minute of a 9 month pregnant wife as you get
yeah.
diagnosed and have to make decisions in the middle of a hurricane with a brand new house. Oh my gosh. Okay, so the swirls of stress are getting larger and larger. So we know that clearly was a major component. But let's talk a little bit about, you had to move really quickly. It sounds like you were diagnosed and then immediately went into surgery. So
Yeah.
is this a fast growing cancer? What's the urgency look like?
Yeah, it is. So it is a fast growing cancer. It's a fast spreading cancer. And for that reason, chemotherapy is actually very effective against it. Chemo tends to be more effective against the faster growing cancers. But yeah, so they diagnosed, and once it became clear, it took about, a full day in the hospital to get that diagnosis. And then the urologist at the hospital was like, okay, let's get you on the schedule for tomorrow, which was a Saturday. And so the next afternoon, I went through the surgery and then recovered that week. So, and then that week during my recovery is when I remember racking myself over, whether or not to do the chemotherapy.
Were there any other symptoms besides the swelling that someone should be aware of or when they're thinking about testicular cancer?
No, typically there aren't. So self-exam is pretty important in the case of testicular cancer. And so basically looking for any painless lumps and bumps down there. And if anything down there that's suspicious, talk to your doctor about it and then get an ultrasound if there's something down there. There are plenty of masses in that area that are not cancer. There's veins that can become dilated. There's cysts that can occur. So not every mass down there is cancer. And like I said, when I had it, I spent 6 weeks thinking that it was a viral inflammation of the testicle and didn't know. And in my head too, I think I probably thought like, hey, you're 37 years old. Like, I don't have any family history of testicular cancer or anything like that. And so in my mind, why would I have testicular cancer? But it's one of those things. Um, and I'm not sure if the COVID played a role or not. These are all questions I've asked for my oncologist. Nobody really has an answer. They're like, probably not, maybe. When I was in the hospital, though, about to go in for the surgery, one of the techs at the hospital or one of the staff there was like, "Oh yeah, we've been seeing a lot more of things like this. Not necessarily testicular cancer, but just you know fast-growing cancers in general." There was a study that came out that did show that it seemed like uh, since COVID has been around, people were presenting with more late stage cancers than not. And is that from COVID? Is that from something else? Certainly, I think a certain amount of it is that people didn't, didn't get their cancer screening for 2 years or 3 years in some cases. And so maybe some of the screenings that people would have got from like routine colonoscopies or mammograms or pap smears or what have you, could have prevented some earlier so it could have prevented some late stage cancers and caught it at an earlier stage. Does COVID increase cancer growth itself? I don't think we know the answer to that. And was it a factor in my case? Again, hard to say. But these are all things, when you play around in your head, like, okay, why did I get this cancer? You try to make sense of the pattern, right? So these are all things that, I've thought about for too long, I think.
I think that's natural. And I think that any of us in this situation certainly have been in this. But I actually think it's one of the most valuable things we can do is to think about, because for I don't know if you did genetic testing, but I also did not have it in my family history. It was not a genetic fact, a mutation. It was because of epigenetics or the things that I eat, drink, think, and do, whether that's the environment that I surround myself with or the stress we're under or the lack of sleep, all those things really do contribute to your body's ability to become hospitable to cancer.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so, how much did the fact, like if I never got in that car accident, if I had been sleeping well, if, you know, et cetera, if I never got COVID, would I have gotten cancer at that time? Would I have gotten it later? Would I have not gotten it at all? And so I don't know, obviously, the answer. I wish I could run a simulation to figure that out. But, maybe it had been there for a long time and maybe it just grew faster as a result of those things. Um, I wasn't, I do recommend, this is medical advice. I do recommend doing self-examination on testicles for men, every month or so or what have you. It's easy to do. It doesn't cost any money. But I had not been doing that myself. It just hadn't really occurred to me, you know. So I would recommend that.
I think, and we recommend being a data G. And so what you just said is being a data G doesn't mean only blood tests or PET scans or mammograms, but it is self exams, making sure you actually look at your body and look for inconsistencies and differences. All of these things can be early indicators of cancer. And as we both know, cancer is a game of speed. The earlier you detect it, the earlier you can eradicate it, the more likely you are to have a long and healthy life afterwards. So for everyone out there, your medical advice is be a data G, gather your data, make sure you're doing all the things you need to do so that you really have the information to help you act as quickly as possible. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, from a perspective, what was your lifestyle like before that? Were there any things that you had to dramatically shift as a result of the surgery or anything like that?
So I had to take a week off work totally to just recover, obviously. I have always been health conscious. And I've always been somebody who has, uh been pretty conscious about their exercise and nutrition in general. However, when it comes to after cancer, I did, you know, I was like, okay, are there things that I can do in order to reduce the chance of this coming back? And from a lifestyle perspective. And so there aren't randomized controlled trials out there that have looked at like, okay, um the do does exercise reduce the risk of testicular seminoma coming back or spreading later? But there's plenty of basic science data that says that exercise is great and helps against cancer. There are things out there that say, okay, that cancer loves glucose and insulin, and so it makes a certain amount of intuitive sense that, like, okay, we want to keep our glucose levels in control and in check and do that with good nutrition, and avoiding things like highly processed foods and sugars. And so I kind of went on this like, all right, what are the five different things I should be doing? And I kind of broke it down into categories. So one was exercise, one was nutrition, one was um, supplements, and I also ended up doing fasting protocols, and then also uh, regular sauna use, and then some contrast therapy, going from hot sauna to a cold pool, etc. Again, there aren't randomized controlled trials that have looked at all of these things, but in my mind, what I was trying to do is give myself as much time in something called autophagy as possible. And so autophagy is the state where your body is basically constantly patrolling itself and looking for inconsistencies and abnormalities. And we all rely on our immune system in order to basically get rid of bad actors, foreign cells, etc. And so, cancer is kind of it's a, some people think of it as like a disease of decadence, because it likes glucose, it likes insulin, it likes stress and cortisol. And so anything that can kind of reduce those substrates that cancer tends to like to grow, I thought, okay, I'll just take it upon myself to reduce that as much as possible. So what I did was in spurts, I would fast in like a 4 hour window for about 3 weeks at a time. Um, and I can't keep that up like indefinitely. So that's why I would like set these like hard endpoints for it. I figured that out eventually, but so I did it like 3 weeks at a time and then off for a week or two, and then 3 weeks at a time, then off for a week or two. And then I started doing it like every scan I'd get back, so I'd get a scan back after 4 months, it was negative, and then I'd say, okay, so now it's time for me to do my fasting protocol again. And then sometimes I would match it up with other holidays or events or things like that. So right now I'm on a 6 hour fast 5 days a week for 40 days, corresponding with Orthodox Lent. Um, I'm not particularly religiously observant when it comes to Orthodox Lent, but for me, it just helps. Okay, there's already a calendar there. There's people are fasting anyway for other reasons, and so I'm gonna hop on that and fast for Orthodox Lent these 40 days. Um, and then additionally, a couple of supplements, in particular sulforaphane, added to my regimen in terms of things that I looked at, like, okay, may reduce the risk of cancer in general coming back, etc. Take a few other vitamins and things like that. I don't go just personally, I don't go too crazy on the supplements, but there's a couple that I definitely take. And then my sauna use and exercise and contrast and cold and things like that, I do pretty consistently about 5 days a week. Um, so I figured kind of with all of those interventions, I can at least say, okay, from a basic science perspective, you basically have given yourself the best chance that you can in order to turn your body into a way that, like, the cancer is in an inhospitable environment.
It's really interesting and important for our listeners. And I think it's kind of the strategy once you've had cancer and survived it. And it really needs to be, how do I become the healthiest version of myself so my immune system can be focused on what it needs to be focused? So you used the scientific word of autophagy, absolutely correct. But for all the rest of us, really, it's giving yourself every advantage by allowing your immune system to be pointed at the stuff that can kill you versus the everyday toxins and issues and things like that. So it's giving your body the right nutrients and support and exercise so that you can really thrive. And I think it's everyone's goal once you have had cancer. But the truth of the matter is it needs to be everyone's goal, regardless of if you've had cancer, because as a reminder, by 2026, 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime. 92% of cancers because of what we eat, drink, think, and do. So you have the power to reverse the roles early on. So I just want to bring that back to our listeners, just to think about that, of the power stays within you to make your body inhospitable to cancer, regardless of if you've ever had a diagnosis or not. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I did want to ask you, how did you decide on things like sauna and contrast therapy? Were there any specific did you look at NIH or any specific research places that our listeners might be able to tap into as well?
So for me, it was more I the studies that seemed to uh, that kind of geared me towards that were looking at things like heat shock protein, and cold attack proteins, and these are uh, in states of high stress, good stress from exercise, from fasting, etc. You will basically, your body has to go through this autophagy process. It has to basically separate the wheat from the chaff. It has to say, okay, what cells are important to survive? Okay. And cancer type cells are not going to be able to grow in that kind of environment, or at least that was my rationale behind the literature out there, the scientific literature out there, what we know behind these things. And so in things like sauna and cold therapy, it's kind of recreating that environment that basically is also like a high exercise environment. And so between those three things, exercise, sauna, cold, and fasting, you're creating a difficult environment for cells to survive anyway. Okay. And so your body has to prioritize the good over the bad. At least that's how I looked at it. That was my rationale. And so I was like, okay, how do I create these environments in my body in order to do that? And that's what basically led me down those paths. I will say one other thing. I have a couple of things to say about like the mental component of this. And I know part of that was part of doing all this was like just knowing that I have options to basically take control as much as I could. Me being able to say at the end of the day, like, okay, I did this, this, and this, to help fight a recurrence of cancer was helpful for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
allows you to sleep easier at night, knowing that you've done your part. And I think that's something that, being your own champion and taking responsibility for your decisions is part of what Mojo is trying to help patients do, of like, you can do something. You don't just abdicate control and do what a doctor tells you. You take control and you do what you can from a diet and lifestyle and exercise, and it's something, do everything you can to give yourself every advantage. And I think that's exactly what you're saying as well.
Exactly. And just for me, it was like a mentally like peace of mind. And so, the other part that's kind of a little is I think a little more difficult for me is, you might be able to tell from this. So I can have a little bit of like an obsessive kind of personality. Um, and so uh it's sometimes a little difficult if you start doing all these things and then you say, okay, but I also need to like not stress out about them, you know, like it needs to be okay that I didn't sauna today, or whatever, because I had, other responsibilities, right? Or what have you. And so for me, that balance is a little bit tough, because, especially at first. Now I'm in, a better state, so there are things, in terms of myself, I know I could do better. I've dabbled in things like meditation, and whatnot, that have been helpful, that I should do more often. But trying to give yourself as much of an edge as possible, trying to give yourself knowing that you can do and do things that help prevent the recurrence of cancer, I think is very, very helpful. At the same time, uh, not over getting overly obsessed with it is also probably a pitfall to stay away from.
I just had a real, taxi cab confessional with our last podcast guest, which was Dr. Russell Jaffe. And I said it, off record. And I said, I feel like I'm almost getting an eating disorder sometimes because I'm so worried about what I'm putting in my body. And I'm so worried about what I'm going to eat that before I go on a trip, I'm stressed about. And I was like, it's kind of taking part of the joy out of life. And he gave me this. So I'll share this with you. And he's like, Julie, your goal is to be 80% perfect. And so if 80% of the time you're doing everything you can, then you have to let the other 20% go. And I love joy. Joy is kind of central to who I am. It's my mantra is maximize joy. So can't forebode and rob the joy of the moment because I'm so afraid of what I'm doing in my body today. And so I think that's another part of to our listeners of be as good as you can, but nobody's perfect, not even a doctor.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that advice. That's really excellent. Yeah, you have to allow yourself room to be, imperfect and to fall short and to know that it's still okay.
Okay, so let's think about this. And this is something that I don't think many people think about. But when you have been diagnosed, you always have something in the back of your mind thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to prepare myself? What am I doing? So I think we're doing everything we can from diet and lifestyle and exercise. And it sounds like you're doing PET scans, but are you doing anything else from blood markers or anything like that to be monitoring your health so that you can identify if there's any change and act quickly?
Good question. So for me, it's actually I am actually doing MRI of my abdomen every 4 months. Normally they do CTs. I had to get a lot of CTs, obviously, when I was diagnosed with cancer, and I'm exposed to a certain amount of radiation at work. And so for me, I'm opting for the MRI instead of the CT just to kind of limit my radiation exposure. Fortunately, with testicular cancer is when it tends to come back, it tends to come back in a very specific area in the abdomen. And so for me, I'm just kind of able to monitor that. And I've actually asked my oncologist about tumor markers and things like that. And he hasn't he said it's not really necessary in your case in terms of that. We generally just monitor it. And so my goal, for now is I'm about a year and a half in, and so different markers in my head. If I make it to 2 years without recurrence, then the chance of it coming back does go quite a bit down. And then after that, if I make it to 5 years, the chance of it coming back um, is very, very small. Um,
Can I ask you a question on that? Because
yeah.
it took me about a year to understand why. And so for our listeners, I just want to ask this question. And so at 2 years, or at 5 years, there for different parts of our body regenerate in different time frames. So there are cellular, and I'm gonna butcher this. So I'm gonna add Nadius. Let's ask you to explain this. Like, why does it matter if it's been 2 years or 5 years with cell reproduction?
Well, so my understanding, to be honest, is so when we take out a tumor, right, or when we eliminate a tumor through other means like chemotherapy, etc., um, we're taking out a large proportion of the cancer cells in that person's body. But if somebody has a tumor like I had, reality is there's thousands, if not millions, of cells in that person's body, basically trying to colonize different areas in order to grow cancer. Okay, and so the reality is your body, even though you don't see it, even though we don't have perfect detection strategies in order to see those cellular uh, small little areas of cancer that were basically going from in my case, my left testicle through my abdomen, through my liver, through other areas, and trying to colonize other areas, brain, spine, lungs, etc., tissue, and then fighting my immune system all along the way. The reality is that fight occurs over a long period of time, and it probably ebbs and flows, and it probably takes a long time to figure out who won. And so if your body basically is sometimes able to fight off the cancer with your immune cells for a long period of time. It may work in one area of the body, it may not work in another area of the body, and the reality is it probably just ebbs and flows and goes back and forth. And the there's a number of cells in the body, like liver cells, they live for 6 months. There's other cells like skin cells, hair cells, things like that live for a much shorter time frame. Blood cells, 90 to 120 days, something like that. And so uh, if you have certain set of cells that are regenerating and fighting, and then other cells that are regenerating and fighting, et cetera, we know that this process goes on for months and sometimes years, and we can see it come back, and in some patients sooner than later.
I think that's, I'm focused on that 5 year mark because I know for me within the colon, most of your cells have kind of regenerated within 5 years. So at 5 years, you're in a much better place than at 2 years. And the cell memory has been somewhat forgotten. So I'm crossing my fingers that both of us make it to 5 years overall survival. But I cut you off early in our conversation about something you were mentioning about your decision to do chemo or not do chemo. And I was also offered what I would say is preventative chemo. For me, it was a little bit more of a challenge because I had cancer actively growing in my body. As soon as I had the surgery, we could find spots, and immediately it had become inoperable and grew to places beyond just the colon. So for me, it became not a preventative, it became a life saving approach to do something else in the conventional world. But in your situation, it really was, listen, this is preventative. You kind of mentioned there was an 80% chance that you were likely doing this for no value. So what are some of the things, are there anything else that you would say weighed into your decision to decide yes or no in doing this preventative treatment?
Yeah, so my experience in the medical field definitely weighed into that quite a bit. Um, so my background is trying to help people actually avoid invasive procedures. And part of the reason for that is, I've seen a lot of, the fancy term is iatrogenesis, which means that the intervention or the physician intervention can actually cause another issue or another problem. And so I know that the medical industry's bias is to do an intervention. And so just in the back of my head, I think that's always been there. And so when I was looking up whether or not that I wanted to do chemotherapy and getting advice from one doctor to say, yes, definitely do the chemo, I know that medical doctors tend to want to offer things because they have it as a thing to offer. And just looking at the data, I just knew that also that the brand of chemotherapy, there's not a lot of people looking at um, 10, 20-year, 30-year side effects. Oftentimes when people get chemotherapy, they tend to be at an older stage of life than I am at. And so, I didn't know if in 30 years, what are my chances for a secondary cancer, meaning cancer that, that the chemotherapy could perhaps contribute to, at X number of years later. And so I had those things kind of swimming around in my head, at the same time as looking at the odds of survival and the odds of it coming back and the odds of the preventative chemo. And I think that those experiences of mine and those biases of mine probably pushed me towards the non-chemo side.
I think you just introduced a new word into our lexicon, and that's iatrogenesis. And that's something that I think it's important for everyone to understand because it is one of the questions that I want to encourage you to begin asking your doctors as they're recommending things of what does this actually do to my overall survival versus just the risk of cancer cells being reproduced. So there's a difference in and part of my job as an industrial psychologist to study what is the purpose of a specific job or their key performance indicators. And the KPIs for your oncologist are to reduce cancer burden. They are not so that you can live a long and happy life 30 years after cancer. That is a different job. So that is your job to make sure you're thinking about how am I going to live a long and happy life 20 or 30 years after my diagnosis? And how do I set myself up for that life? And so there is sometimes a difference of are we doing this for short-term success in treating cancer or long-term success and overall survival and quality of life? And I just want to introduce that idea to you, to our listeners, so that you can make sure that you're thinking about the recommendations and asking the questions of to really understand, does this increase my overall survival by 1 or 2% or by 50 or 60%? Because that might help change your approach and what you'd really want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of brings us to the concept of lifespan versus health span. So, lifespan, obviously is easy to measure, right? How long do you live? And that's kind of the main outcome measure in cancer studies, of course, or a lot of them. But health span is a little different. And, it's how, how healthy are you as you age, right? Are you able to are you able to do the normal activities of daily living? Are you able to be comfortable and age well and have your faculties, etc.? Um, or are you just, I think a lot of people um, would not necessarily want to live in constant pain where they were suffering for years, but the concept of lifespan doesn't fully cover, how healthy somebody is or how well they're aging. And so there's a great book out there fairly recently called Outlive by Peter Attia. Maybe it's come up on your podcast before, but he dives into health span and lifespan, and I would recommend that book to patients. He does go into cancer quite a bit in that book as well.
Wonderful. We definitely will link to that as well. So appreciate the recommendation. And I think that idea of like health span, I don't want to live, I want to live well. I want
Yeah.
to live a life filled with joy and love and happiness and success and gratitude and all the things we need. It's not just I want to have a pulse. And I think that was one of the things that woke me up and shifted my approach early on in my diagnosis is, I had seen a friend who was going through chemotherapy and she looked like a pulse, like a corpse with a pulse, and was
Yeah.
miserable and truly it was a dark room, and she could barely handle light, she could barely handle movement, she could handle talking. And I thought, I want to avoid that. And that's part of the reason why I worked so hard to build my body up, so that when I was going through treatment, I wouldn't face the suffering. But the truth is just, as much work as I did, which I had 10 different healers, I had all the supplements in the world, I did all the diet and lifestyle, all the things, the sleep, the environmental approach, the stress. And yet I still went to the dentist last Friday and was told that the treatment has robbed my teeth of their health, and I need 4 crowns and 4 fillings. So like, even with all the work I did to prevent and all the things I did to have no side effects, my body is still telling that I've had some conventional treatment, and the impact will be felt for many, many years, to be real.
Yeah, there was an interesting study I read a few years ago where it talked about um, physicians' own decisions when it comes to their end of life care. And it turns out then that when physicians are at the end of their life, they opt for way less intervention than your average person, because they tend to be more knowledgeable on what those interventions actually involve. And so I think, you know, it's hard to know if you're not familiar with those kinds of things. I think, but as I said, I think the medical field is generally biased towards intervening on things, and it's hard for people to know, okay, is this intervention actually something that's going to make me healthier and live longer, as opposed to well, there's a small chance that it'll help increase your lifespan at the risk of pretty serious side effects.
For sure. It's those sorts of questions where you've got to be your own advocate and bring some of the skepticism into this. Part of the skepticism that has kept me alive is that I tracked blood markers outside of my oncologist during chemotherapy to make sure it was working, and figured out it wasn't working long before the 6-month PET scan that they had scheduled. So bringing your own data and making sure that you are kind of filling in the gaps between the cracks, because let's be real, our doctors have 9 minutes to spend with us every 4 to 6 weeks or whatever time they see with us. This is not something where they're pouring over our records at 3 a.m. on a Saturday night. That's just not real. So it really is imperative for us to be asking those questions and bring the skepticism to the table, so that we make sure we get the very best outcomes possible. All right, Ignatios, if you were to give any more wisdom to our audience, what would you say is really important from your survival story that they think about in their journey?
I would say that I think Um, a lot of the interventions that I've done, they target health as a whole, and in patients that have cancer, it's obviously very important. But in patients that have, that don't have cancer, the patients that are at risk for heart disease because of a family history or because of lifestyle or diabetes or stroke or plenty of other things that cause disease, morbidity and mortality, and reduce your lifespan and reduce how active you can be. I think that there are always things that people can look at and try to prevent, and try to be more proactive. And the old saying about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is definitely true, and it's definitely very important wisdom that I don't think the medical field really is equipped to relay to people. And so I think that people kind of have to be their own advocates. I think that you know you shouldn't wait until you have borderline diabetes in order to get your nutrition under control, for instance. Okay. And with that, we know that diabetes increases your risk of cancer, by at least threefold, maybe more. And so uh, my advice would be, you know get proactive, in order to prevent things that, maybe it's cancer, maybe it's something else, maybe it's a recurrence of cancer. You know, I think that there are things that everybody can do to try to improve their odds and their chances for survival and having a happy, healthy life.
Your health span is a direct correlation to the investment you make in yourself, from a diet, a lifestyle, a environment, a stressors, an abuse, all the things. When you say I'm worth more, I am willing to put my energy where it matters most, you will have a much longer and happier life. I'm sure of it, regardless of what diagnosis you could be facing. It is worth, you are worth your energy. So, all right, Ignatios, I can't thank you enough for the wisdom you've imparted. I can't thank you for sharing your story. I can't thank you for being brave enough to explain kind of what your approach has been and what you've learned. And I have one final question for you. And that is, most people think of cancer as a death sentence. So as soon as they get the cancer word, they think, oh, my life will never be the same. Now you have a newish baby, a new home, you're a hardworking doctor. Post cancer, is your life strong? Is it good? Are you happy? Like, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very fortunate to do a profession that I love, that brings me a lot of contentment and joy. At the same time, I also have three small children, actually, 5, 3, and 1 now. So they keep me very, very busy. And the cancer part, I never really thought about getting cancer in myself before this. And the one or maybe one of the silver linings around it, it does put things into perspective that you've never thought about, having to come toe to toe with your mortality way before you thought you would. Does I think emphasize the right things and de-emphasize the right things in your life. So you know, uh, getting that kind of perspective, I think, is very helpful.
It's I couldn't agree more. Like the way I spend my time and energy, the what I care about, what I invest in, it's so different because so much of what I used to care about doesn't matter once you've been faced with death. And now I can double down on the people I really value and the work I want to do and the differences I want to make in this world, because like becomes simple once you've had cancer, because I'm not going to waste time on what doesn't matter anymore. So I love that as well. Well, as I said, thank you so much for joining us and being courageous enough to share your story. And we really wish you a lifetime of health and of success and of joy, because we know that that's what makes the world go round. So thank you so much, Dr. Papas, Nadias, for being part of MOJO Rising.
You're very welcome. Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. For all of our listeners, we hope that some of the knowledge bombs dropped today will help you live your better life. And if nothing else, we hope that you will invest one thing differently, whether that is in diet or lifestyle or energy, so that you can make sure that your body is less hospitable to cancer as a result of this conversation today. May each of you live long and lucky. Thanks so much for joining in.